I was 3 days into the trail when I realized just how truly alone I was, and I hope you guys enjoyed this awful memory of mine. It started out with steady foot traffic, hikers passing with polite nods and the occasional bit of small talk. A couple of them had asked where I was headed to, and when I said I was aiming to complete the whole trail, their expression ranged from impressed to skeptical. I get it though, a solo woman, first time on a thru hike, pushing through in the middle of nowhere, it wasn't exactly the safest idea, but I personally had prepped for this for months and months. I had my gear, my maps, and I'd studied the trail reports obsessively. I even planned my campsites down to the mile, picking spots near water sources, places with some history of foot traffic as well. Safety in numbers, even if it was just the lingering presence of a few other campers. But today, as I hiked down into the gorge, I realized I hadn't seen another person since noon yesterday. It was beautiful though. I mean, even more than that, it was untouched and almost sacred land. The trees leaned in close together, their branches knitted together overhead, dappling the trail with shifting patterns of gold and green. Pools of crystal clear water dotted the area, some no bigger than bathtubs. Others would stretch out like miniature lakes, reflecting the sky in a perfect blue. A thin wandering creek curled through the gorge, about 3/4 of a mile ahead, its bubbling sound faint but consistent, like distant voices whispering. The air smelled of moss and damp earth, a deep grounding scent that made me feel more like I stepped back in time. I chose a campsite tucked near one of the larger pools, a plateau of flat ground nestled between rocks. It was perfect, out of direct sight from the trail, but close enough that I could still find my way back if I wandered off a bit. I set up my tent and stretched out my sleeping bag, boiled some water for my usual bland dehydrated dinner. It wasn't much, but it would do. I was finishing up my meal when I saw this guy. He was maybe 50 yards away, a figure at first moving slow, but head down. My stomach clenched, not with fear exactly, but with that deep, instinctive awareness that I was no longer alone. I watched as he came closer, stepping over roots and stones like he'd done this 1,000 times before. He looked up, spotted me, and lifted a hand in this casual wave. I hesitated, but then waved back at him. That should have been it, right? A moment shared of acknowledgement, and he'd move on, disappearing down the trail like all the others had done, but instead, he started to veer toward me. By the time he was close enough to see clearly, I had already checked my options. My gear was packed up enough that I could leave in a hurry if I needed to. I had my small folding knife in my pocket, more of a comfort than an actual weapon though. "Hey there," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I didn't expect to see anybody out here. Thought I'd have the whole place to myself." His voice was friendly, easy. He seemed to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, shaggy brown hair, and a few days worth of stubble. His clothes were well worn but not filthy. His pack was bulky but looked pretty organized. "Yeah, same here," I responded. "Been pretty quiet today." He nodded and then shifted his weight, looking past me toward my campsite. "Hey, you mind if I set up near you just for the night? Safety in numbers, right?" I won't lie, every instinct I had screamed no, no, no. But he was already dropping his pack. Internally, I convinced myself it's not a big deal. People camp near each other on the trail all the time. This is normal. But it was just something in the way that he just immediately claimed the space. Like my answer had never even mattered. He was going to do it anyway. And that thought made my skin prickle. I shifted back towards my tent and put a little more distance between us. "Yeah, I guess so. Just for the night though, right?" Darius introduced himself and got to work setting up his tent. He talked as he did it, casual like we were old friends. He said he'd been on the trail for 5 days already, started from the opposite end and was making his way out. He asked about my route then, how I was finding the hike so far and what I did when I wasn't out in the woods. I answered him, but with each word I found myself giving him less and less information. I definitely didn't tell him where I lived, didn't mention that I was hiking alone with nobody expecting me for days. I kept it pretty vague, as safe as possible. The sun then dipped lower, and he started collecting firewood, stacking up this small mountain of sticks and branches between our tents. "No point in freezing out here," he said. "Might as well have a good fire tonight." I hadn't planned on one. The fire meant visibility. It meant advertising exactly where we were, drawing in anybody, anything, watching from the dark. But his lighter was already out. He was already coaxing the first flames to life, and I guess I wasn't going to argue. The fire cast these flickering lights against the trees, and the shadows then came out to play as the sun continued to disappear. Darius then grinned at me through the glow. "Have you eaten yet?" "Yeah, I did," I lied. He unzipped his pack, pulled out this small pot, a pack of instant rice, a can of beans, and of all things, a vacuum-sealed steak. My stomach clenched. I hadn't eaten a real meal in almost 3 days now. "Come on," he said, laughing. "I can hear your stomach growling from all the way over here." I hesitated, but the smell of that meat sizzling in the pot completely broke me. I sat by the fire as he cooked, my muscles aching from that day's hike, exhaustion seeping into my bones. He handed me a plate, and I didn't even think before I took the first bite. It was incredible, warm, filling, real. And just like that, I'd let my guard down. We talked as we ate, and he was charming in this way that I really didn't expect. He had stories about past hikes, weird encounters on the trail, even a few close calls with wildlife. He made me laugh, and for a while I forgot about the weariness that I felt before, the way he just moved in without asking. The night deepened, the fire burned lower, and a part of me knew I should just go to bed, should rest a while, but the warmth of the fire and the weight of my full stomach made it hard to move. At some point, I think I dozed off, and it wasn't for long, maybe just a few seconds. I woke to silence. The fire was just embers now, barely glowing, casting these weak pulsing lights. The air was cold, the kind of deep aching chill that settled into your bones. And when I looked over, Darius was just staring at me. I stiffened, forcing out a breath. What? He blinked, like I just interrupted something. "Nothing, you were sleeping." I swallowed hard. "Yeah, I guess I should turn in." I stood up, rubbing my arms against the cold, and turned toward my tent. Footsteps then right behind me. I twisted and my heart started hammering. Darius was now standing and far too close. Close enough that I could smell the wood smoke clinging to his clothes, the lingering scent of dinner on his breath. "Where are you going?" I asked. To bed, long day tomorrow." I laughed, but he didn't smile at all. There was a pause, the silence pressing in around us. Then softly, like he was stating this undeniable fact, "I thought we were going to bed." My pulse pounded in my head. "We?" His expression didn't change. "Yeah, I thought that's what this was." A sick, crawling feeling twisted in my gut. "No, Darius, that's not what this was." A moment broke and he reached for me. I stumbled back, boots slipping against the dirt. "Whoa, what the hell are you doing?" He didn't answer me. His hand closed around my wrist, tight, fingers pressing into my skin. Panic flared. I thought he was gonna kill me. I yanked back, but he didn't let me go. "Darius," I said, trying to sound in control. "Let me go." He smiled, and it didn't even reach his eyes. "Come on," he murmured. "No need to play hard to get." I twisted, but he was much stronger than me. His grip almost was like iron. I felt like if I fought anymore, my arm would snap off. Then I moved without thinking, and I drove my knee up hard. He made this noise, something between a grunt and a wheeze, and his hand slackened just enough. I ripped my arm free and shoved him back and bolted. The woods then swallowed me whole. Branches clawed at my arms, my legs. The cold air burned my throat. I was running blindly, boots slipping against the uneven ground, my breath coming in these ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was deep in the trees, far enough that I could no longer see the glow of the fire. Only then did I crouch down and force myself to listen. Silence. I caught my breath quietly as I could and did my best to disappear into the earth. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps, slow, coming from the way I came. I clamped a hand over my mouth, stifling the ragged sound of my breathing. A voice was then floating through the trees. "Okay," Darius called out. "You've had your fun." I squeezed my eyes shut. "Come on. It's cold out here. Don't be dumb." I stayed still. Footsteps moved closer and then stopped. This long, stretching silence. And then, "Fine," he said. "I'll see you in the morning." A long pause, and I barely recognized his voice now. He sounded fucking crazy. Then I heard the retreating footsteps, and I still didn't move. Not for a long, long time. I awoke cold and aching, back pressed against the damp forest floor. My body curled so tight that my muscles screamed in protest. The sky had turned into a dull gray, the first tints of morning slipping through the trees. I hadn't slept, really, just drifted in and out. Every snap of a twig jerked me back to full awareness. I listened. The woods were quiet. No footsteps, no voice calling my name. No Darius. I lay there for a little longer, just wanting to be sure, but every second I wasted out here, every moment I spent lying in the dirt like an animal, felt like another invitation for him to come back. I slowly crept forward, my limbs stiff from the cold and cramped from the way I'd been laying, moving quietly as I could. When I reached the edge of the trees, I stopped and scanned the campsite. He was gone. His tent was gone, his pack, and no sign that he'd ever even been there at all. My tent was still standing. My bag was propped up against the tree, my trekking poles leaning right where I left them. I slowly and cautiously stepped into the clearing, waiting for something to be wrong, for a note, a message, a sign that he wasn't done with me, but there was nothing. Just the remnants of the fire, burned down to blackened wood and cold ash. I moved quickly, tearing down my tent in record time, shoving everything into my pack with trembling hands. I continuously fought off the urge to cry, fought that lump rising up in my throat. With blurry eyes, I got all my stuff together, secured it on my back, and disappeared off the trail. I was certain that he was still around somewhere. I had been so close. If I let my guard down just a little more, if I laughed at the wrong moment, if I hadn't moved fast enough when he grabbed me. I blinked, refusing to let the tears come. My hands fumbled, useless with adrenaline and exhaustion. I had to stop, pressing the heels of my palms into my eyes, forcing slow, deep breaths. I wasn't dead, and that had to mean something. By the time I took my first steps, my legs were unsteady beneath me, but I forced myself to start walking. I didn't run, I didn't even walk fast, I just moved. Methodical, careful, in the same direction as yesterday. I'm gonna finish this hike, regardless of that fucking prick. I didn't know how long he'd been gone for, and I didn't know if he was off waiting for me somewhere, watching just out of sight. I did not stop looking over my shoulder. The trail stretched off before me, empty and endless. But I felt him behind me that whole way, even when I knew he wasn't there. Even when I passed other hikers, groups of them, laughing and completely unaware, oblivious to what had happened to me miles behind them. I kept my distance from every single person that I encountered, not wanting to put myself at risk again. If I saw somebody from a distance, I cleared the trail, hiked parallel to it until we were clear of each other. I kept walking, kept moving, and kept breathing. By the time I reached the trailhead 3 days later, my body was completely wrecked. Blisters layered over blisters. My legs ached deep inside the bone. My shoulders felt like they'd been stretched on a rack, but I didn't care. I signed out of the logbook with a shaking hand and just stared at my name, at the date. Then I looked at entries before mine. Darius's name was there, scrawled in thick, uneven letters, the same day as mine. I felt my stomach drop. He had left the trail just before me by a few hours. He'd apparently cut back the same way he came from, the same direction that I'd been going. I turned and scanned the lot, the road beyond. A dozen cars, maybe more. All of them unfamiliar, obviously. It's a national park. Still, it was extremely creepy. I felt exposed out there in the open, standing there with my pack, exhausted and just hollow. I walked over to my car, threw my gear in, locked the doors the second I got inside. I squeezed the steering wheel, knuckles torn to shreds. I then made myself take one last deep breath. Then I started the engine and I left that nightmare, and I haven't set foot on that trail since. I grew up inside a small town, so small that you'd miss it if you blinked. The kind of place where everybody knew each other's business, where weekends meant fishing, bonfires, or shooting cans off the back porch. My best friend Chris lived about 15 miles outside of town, on a real ranch, horses, cattle, barn dogs, the whole deal. His family had owned that land for 3 generations, and we'd been running around it since we were old enough to carry BB guns and pretend that we were hunting. One spring break, Chris asked if I wanted to go on this cattle run with him. Just the two of us, out on horseback, rounding up stray cattle that had wandered a little too far from the main ranch. His dad usually sent a couple of hired hands to do it, but they were really short-staffed, and Chris figured we could handle it ourselves. 2-3 days tops. We'd camp out under the stars, eat canned beans and creek trout, play cowboy. I didn't really have anything better to do, so of course I said yes. We prepped in the morning, saddlebags packed with enough food to last us, a .22 rifle and Chris's dad's old .38 revolver, just in case we encountered any coyotes or wolves. The land itself was mostly rolling hills, scattered trees, and stretches of tall grass that rustled in the wind. Easy country to ride through, nothing too rough. I really wasn't worried, and Chris knew that land better than anybody, so I trusted him. By the time we rode out, the sun was warm on our backs, the scent of earth and horse sweat filling up the air. The ranch slowly disappeared behind us, and we followed this winding creek bed deeper into the land, hooves clopping steadily against the packed dirt. We had no cell service out there, never really did, but that was normal. You learn to live without it when you grew up in a place like ours. About 3 hours in, we started spotting cattle, lazy bigbacks, chewing grass and flicking their tails. Chris would give this low whistle, horse cutting wide to push them to the right direction, and I'd ride up behind to make sure that none would peel off. Slow work, but steady. By midday, we had about 30 head of cattle gathered up in this lower field, contently grazing. The plan was simple: keep pushing forward, gathering more as we went, then lead them all back to the main ranch when we had them all. By late afternoon, the land started changing. The hills were getting steeper and the trees were growing denser. Not real forest, but enough to cover and feel enclosed. Chris pointed to a ridge up ahead, said there was an old campsite where we could use it for the night. It had a fire pit and enough space for the horses to settle in. We reached it just as the sun was going down, and the place was exactly as Chris described it. Flat ground, a ring of blackened stone from old campfires, and a couple of thick logs dragged around for seating. It looked used, but not recently. The fire pit was full of charred wood and ashy bits of something that might have been paper. The wind had scattered it enough that I couldn't really tell. We unsaddled the horses, got a fire going, and settled in with cans of chili and a couple of hot dogs speared on sticks. The night was quiet, just the crackle of the fire, the occasional snort of the horses, the distant sound of crickets in the grass. We talked about nothing in particular, school, rumors, girls, dumb shit that we do as kids. Then both of us heard this metallic clang, a slow rhythmic sound like something hitting metal. Clang, pause, clang. Chris literally stopped mid-sentence and furrowed his brow. "You hear that?" I nodded. The wind carried the noise toward us, faint but steady. I didn't know what it was, but something about it felt familiar. Chris listened a second longer and then muttered, "It sounded like a shovel." A shovel? Somebody was out here digging at this time of the night? The sound continued, steady and deliberate, drifting through the open hills like it had been there the whole time. Clang, pause, clang. There was a rhythm to it. The kind that you pace when you're not in a hurry, but not taking your time either. I don't think it was close, but it also wasn't far enough away to ignore. Chris shifted, eyes locked on the darkness below camp. Who the hell would be digging out here? I shook my head. Nobody should have. The land was all his family's, miles and miles of private property, nothing but dirt roads and livestock. No neighbors, no campers, no reason for anybody to be out there with a shovel in the dead of night. But we sat there staring into the black, fire popping and crackling between us. The clang continued. It didn't sound rushed. It didn't sound like somebody struggling. It sounded like somebody had a job to do and planned on finishing it. Chris then stood up, cupped his hands around his mouth and hollered out, "Hey! Who's out there?" The clanging stopped. The only thing we got back was silence. Even the wind seemed to hush itself now. The fire crackled and a horse snorted, but that was it. We both waited, our breath slow and shallow, ears straining. The hills were empty. Chris then turned back to me. Maybe it was an animal or a prospector? I almost laughed aloud. There hadn't been miners in this area since before our grandfathers were born. You think some guy's out here panning for gold? Hell if I know. He sat back down, but his shoulders were tense. Could be a poacher maybe, somebody burying trash. I don't know, man, I'm just thinking out loud here. He grabbed a stick and poked at the fire. They stopped though. Hopefully they heard us and took off. Yeah, or maybe they're burying a body. I nodded. The unease wouldn't shake though. There was something about the way it just stopped, like somebody had been waiting for us to notice it. We finished eating, cleaned up camp a little, and stretched out near the fire. Our boots were now off, our eyes half lidded, the warmth of the fire making us heavy with exhaustion. The horses were settling, standing loose near the trees, tails flicking. The night had returned to normal. And then without warning, something took that peace and just killed it. A loud shriek tore off through the night, high-pitched, raw, nothing human. The horses then exploded into a frenzy, rearing and kicking, hooves slamming against dirt and rock. Chris and I shot up, scrambling to get the reins, our firelight casting these wild shadows. Easy, easy. I gritted my teeth, gripping my horse's bridle, but it was useless. The animal was beyond spooked, muscles coiled like it was ready to rip free and run. Chris was struggling with his own, barely even keeping hold. What the fuck was that? I didn't have an answer for him. I couldn't. My heart was hammering in my chest. That scream had been close, far too close, and it didn't sound anything like a coyote or a mountain lion if I ever heard one. It was long and drawn out, almost distorted. It sounded like something out of a movie. Chris's horse suddenly retched away, breaking free with this loud, hard snap of the reins. It bolted and disappeared off into the dark. Chris cursed and reached for his saddlebag. A second later, the revolver was in his hand. We heard another scream. This time it was closer. The fire burned hot, but the orange glow barely stretched beyond the clearing. Shadows were dancing at the edges, shifting in the grass. Something was moving out there, circling just beyond what we could see. I could hear footsteps, not fast, scrambling steps of an animal, but something else, slow and carefully. Chris's voice was steady. "Keep a hold of your horse." I gripped the leather tight, blood filling up in my ears. My horse was snorting, shifting its weight, ready to bolt just like the other one did. Then a twig snapped. I turned and my heart was in my throat, just as Chris fired. The gunshot split the night, deafening in the open air. That echo rolled across the hills, and my ears rang. For a second, nothing moved. The silence that followed was oppressive. Then something shifted in the grass, a retreating shuffle, quick, almost clumsy. Whatever was near us was now moving away. Not running, not crashing through the brush, just leaving. It kind of reminded me of a porcupine, the way they slowly retreat, almost daring you to mess with them. Chris then exhaled. "You see it?" I just shook my head. "No." We didn't speak for a while after that. We wandered up the hillside and found Chris's horse a few hundred feet away, cornered off by some boulders. We got her back to camp and did our best to relax. The fire popped again, the only real sound inside that clearing. Chris then turned back to me, his grip still tight on that revolver. "We're staying up." I nodded. No way in hell I was going to sleep after that anyway. The hours just crawled by. We kept the fire stoked and our backs to the flames, scanning the dark around us. That metal clang never came back, and we didn't hear any more screams, no more movement, just this uneasy quiet that stretched for far too long. Chris dozed off somewhere around 4, gun still in hand. I sat there, my nerves worn raw, waiting for the sky to light up. And then, just before dawn, I heard a voice, low, deep, and close.
"Hey, boy."
I whipped around so fast I almost fell in the fire. I scanned the darkness. Nothing. Chris stirred, muttering in his sleep, and my horse shifted but didn't spook this time. I swallowed. I was tired. Maybe I did imagine it? My brain playing tricks on me after a long night like this? But then I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the firelight. Not a coyote, not some prowling mountain lion. A man, or something that looked like one. The light was barely touching him, but I could make out the shape. Tall and thin, standing still as a statue. I couldn't see his face, just the vague outlines of limbs. A head tilted slightly like he was watching me. My stomach had turned to ice. Chris, I whispered, not wanting to look away. He groaned as he rubbed against his face. What? I didn't blink, I didn't move. My fingers were clenched around the knife at my belt. Somebody's here. Chris jolted upright, his eyes darting towards where I was staring. The figure hadn't moved. Chris immediately raised the gun. "Who the hell are you?" Silence. Then slowly the figure stepped back. 1 step, then 2 steps, and then he was gone. Chris and I sat there frozen. The sun rose 30 minutes later. We packed up fast and nobody said a word. Chris kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the hills like he expected to see that man again. "What do we do here?" I said. When we were ready to go, he turned to me. His face was pale. "We tell my dad." I just nodded. We rode hard and didn't look back. We rode fast, barely speaking, the cold morning air biting in our faces. The land stretched endlessly around us, but I could not shake the feeling that something was indeed out there, watching from the hills. My body ached from the tension, muscles stiff from gripping the reins. Chris's family's ranch finally came into view, a big sprawling house with a wraparound porch, barns and sheds scattered beyond it. We rode straight to the main house, barely even waiting for the horses to stop before jumping off. Chris's dad, Hank, was already outside sipping a coffee on the porch. He squinted at us, taking in our wild-eye looks and lack of cattle, the gun still in Chris's hand. "The hell happened to you two?" Chris didn't waste any time. "Dad, somebody was out there, digging in the middle of the night, and then we heard, He hesitated, glancing at me before finishing. "Screaming." Hank's face didn't even change. He exhaled slow and rubbed a hand down his weathered face. "Where?" Chris pointed back towards the hills. "Near the camp at the tree line, maybe a mile past the creek." Hank was quiet for a moment and then just nodded. "All right, boys, get inside and warm up. I'm gonna make some calls." I wanted to argue, to say that we should go back out there, but something in his expression just stopped me in my tracks. It didn't sound like this was the first time something had happened like this. We went inside and stripped off our jackets, the warmth of the house making the fear settle a little bit deeper into my bones. Chris's mom had made coffee and didn't ask any questions. It was almost like she already knew. Half an hour later, Hank and two of the ranch hands saddled up and rode off toward the hills. Chris and I sat in silence, the waiting almost worse than the night itself. When they finally returned, Hank's expression was pretty grim. "Well, we found it," he said, stepping off to the porch where we sat. Chris leaned forward. Found what?" Hank hesitated, glancing at the ranch hands. They both looked uneasy. "A hole, freshly dug, 6 feet deep, maybe even more." I swallowed. "Was there anything in it?" Hank's head shook. "Empty." Chris just stood up. "So, somebody was out there digging a grave?" "Seems that way." We let that sit and marinate for a second. The implications of it all, the sheer awful reality of what might have happened if we hadn't been out there to interrupt whoever was digging. Chris just ran a hand through his hair. "Jesus." Hank crossed his arms. "You said you saw somebody?" I nodded. "Yeah, right at the edge of the firelight. He just stood there, watching us." Hank was quiet again, staring off into the hills like they were the Sunday paper. "All right, well, just don't go out that way the rest of the season. We'll keep an eye out. That's really all we can do. Stuff happens out on the land. That's all." And with that, the scariest experience of my entire life was just explained away. Hank's energy told me something else though. Like maybe he knew who or what was out there. Shit, he owned that place. Nobody had spent more time out there than him. Either way, we listened to what Hank said. We didn't ride at that route again. And Chris and I still to this day talk about that night. But we still haven't got any closer to any kind of answer. The 8th grade overnight trip to Black Pine National Park was tradition. Every year, a bunch of middle schoolers piled up onto a bus and spent a weekend hiking and learning about nature, and, if the older kids were to be believed, trying to avoid being eaten alive by mosquitoes the size of a bird. It was the highlight of the year, something that almost all of us would look forward to ever since the 6th grade. That year, though, something went wrong. About halfway to the destination, something happened with the engine and the entire bus sputtered and then died right there along the side of the highway. I remember how loud we were, crammed onto that school bus, backpacks stuffed underneath the seats, kids shouting, tossing chips at one another, teachers yelling half-hearted warnings that nobody listened to. I sat next to my best friend, Ben, near the middle. He had this bag of beef jerky that stunk up our entire section, but nobody really cared. Then the bus lurched forward, a heavy cough from the engine and a loud grinding sound. The entire vehicle just shuddered, and then suddenly we weren't moving at all. At first, nobody thought of it as a big deal. The driver, Mr. Lenny, muttered something underneath his breath, shifted gears and turned the key. Nothing. He tried again. More grinding. Somebody in the back groaned, "Oh, come on." Then the lights flickered. A low buzz filled the air before everything went dark. No overhead lights, no engine hum, nothing but the dim glow of the setting sun seeping through the streaked windows. "What's going on?" somebody asked. One of the teachers, Miss Calloway, stood up and adjusted her glasses. "Everybody stay calm. It's probably just a mechanical issue. Mr. Lenny is handling it." The driver exhaled, unbuckled his seatbelt, then stepped out of the bus. I remember thinking it was a joke, but when I realized that we were legit stranded, I felt this deep fear that I was almost embarrassed to talk about. We were in the middle of nowhere, literally. No houses, no gas stations, no cars passing by. Just this long, empty stretch of two-lane road, cutting through an endless sprawl of badlands. Nothing but wilderness in every direction. It had been at least an hour since we passed a town. The teachers started whispering amongst themselves, and I caught bits and pieces of it. "Can you get a signal? Try calling the school. This isn't good." Ben then nudged me. "Dude, what if we have to spend the night out here?" I smirked. It's better than math class. But deep down, I didn't like it. The bus was suffocating. The trees beyond the window seemed a lot taller than they had before now, like they were pressing down upon us, and they weren't even that close. The nearest tree line was a good 50 yards away. After what felt like forever, Mr. Lenny climbed back inside, wiping his hands on his pants. His face was sweaty and he looked irritated. He didn't need to say anything. We already knew. "It's completely locked up," he finally muttered. "It won't even turn over." A soft murmur swept through the bus. "How long until somebody can get out here?" one of the kids called out. Mr. Ryden pulled out his phone and frowned. "We got to get a hold of the school first, then they'll send another bus out to us." Another bus? From the school? That was hours away. I felt like I was gonna puke. School was easily 200 miles away. Outside, the last traces of sunlight bled away behind the trees. The road was empty. The wind had died down, and the world had gone completely silent. We were alone. The teachers explained we'd be sheltering in the bus until somebody got to us, but being on this old country back road, there really wasn't a lot of traffic. In fact, I couldn't even remember the last time we passed a car. Regardless, we had a bunch of teachers with us, and they all reassured that everything would be fine. We were allowed to change seats, sit by our friends, talk quietly, and eat anything we wanted. After an hour of chilling and eating Doritos with the boys, I felt a little more relaxed. And then, inside that quiet bus, the first scream shattered the night. And it didn't come from inside the bus. That much was clear. It came from out there, somewhere beyond the glow of the emergency lights, out in that vast darkness of wilderness. And for a moment, nobody spoke and nobody moved. Conversations literally stopped mid-sentence. A bag of chips rustled, then stilled as a kid froze with his hands inside them. Somebody cleared their throat, and every head turned towards the windows, toward the place where the scream had emitted from. A single, breathless moment passed by. Then there was nothing, no follow-up, no movement, no explanation. Ms. Calloway was the first to speak, though her voice sounded uncertain. That was probably just a fox. Animals make strange sounds out here." I shook my head. That didn't sound like a fox, it sounded a lot more human. It sounded like somebody being torn apart. Ben, sitting beside me, had gone rigid. "Dude," he whispered. "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer for him. At the front of the bus, Mr. Ryden turned to Mr. Lenny. "Lock the doors. Everybody else, put up your windows." The bus driver, still gripping the dead steering wheel, hesitated for a moment before flipping with a switch. With a loud hiss, the folding doors sealed shut, He turned the key again as well, hoping against hope that this time the engine would come back to life. All he heard was click, nothing, click, click. Still dead. A sinking feeling then pressed into my gut. We were in fact stuck. Miss Calloway did her best to sound reassuring to everybody. All right, kids, let's not panic. It's just an animal. We're all safe inside this bus. But there's something about the way that she said it just made my skin crawl. She wasn't trying to reassure us. It sounded more like she was trying to reassure herself. I turned my head slowly, scanning the rows of wide-eyed kids around me. Most of them had huddled closer together now, whispering amongst themselves, casting nervous glances towards the windows. Outside, the emergency lights cast this dim, flickering glow on the cracked asphalt, illuminating only a few feet of the roadside before the darkness would swallow everything else up. And then we all heard another sound, a soft tap. It came from somewhere behind me against the glass. I heard a few kids gasp. Somebody let out this nervous chuckle, half expecting it to be some prankster, another kid messing around. But then came another one, and this time it was on the other side of the bus, then another and another. Fingertips rapping lightly against the windows, this slow testing rhythm, almost like they were feeling for a weak spot. All right, who's doing that? Miss Calloway snapped, standing up. She turned sharply towards the students, her expression somewhere between anger and fear. Nobody answered. A girl a few rows down from me spoke up. Miss Calloway, it's coming from outside. My blood turned to ice. The knocking was moving now, spreading along the length of the bus. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't frantic and it wasn't aggressive. It was patient and it was everywhere. A rustling noise outside set my heart hammering. I turned to my window and pressed my forehead against the glass and peered out. That's when I caught a glimpse of a face. A pale, almost glowing face hovering just outside the glass, and it was staring back at me. The skin was eerily smooth like polished wax. The eyes were deep, hollow pits, blacker than night itself. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to scream, to say something, anything, but my voice had been stolen from me. Just as soon as I saw it, as it appeared, the face was gone. It didn't vanish, but turned back to dark and seemed to run away. I jerked back, gasping for air. My chest heaved. Ben was staring at me. What? What? He hissed. What'd you see? Before I could answer, another face appeared on the opposite side of the bus. Then another and another. Each one was the same, pale, smooth, smiling. They peered in through the windows, unblinking, as if studying us and admiring us. And then, the bus rocked. A jolt, like something had pushed it. Kids screamed. Teachers barked orders, but their voices were lost beneath the rising panic. The flashlights came out. Miss Calloway flicked hers on and aimed it outside. And that's when we saw the worst of it. Footprints. Dozens of them circling the bus in the dirt. Bare feet. No shoes. Not walking and not wandering, running as fast as humanly possible, and we couldn't see anything that was making them. The flashlight beam jumped erratically as the figures sprinted past, darting in and out of the shadows, but no matter how fast they moved, every time the light passed over them, their lips were peeled back, stretching wide as if to say, cheese. The bus then shook again, harder this time. Someone started sobbing. The air was thick with panic, this electric charge of terror building up towards something unbearable. The teachers were quickly losing control. Mr. Ryden grabbed his phone, muttering frantically, "Come on, come on, come on, answer!" A loud bang then rattled the side of the bus, and a handprint appeared on the window beside me. It wasn't pressed against the glass, it slammed into it. I thought it would crack for sure. Ben and I started to trip out for real at this point, grabbing onto one another and slapping the seats, the whole freak out. My pulse was pounding in my ears. The fingers looked long, tipped with jagged, dirty nails. The skin, just like their faces, smooth, featureless. It was as if they'd been stripped of age, of imperfection, of any form of humanity. Then, just as suddenly as all of the tapping and rocking and noises started, it all stopped. It was gone. Silence swallowing it all up. Nobody spoke and nobody breathed. Then off in the distance, we saw headlights. A bus. The replacement bus. A sob of relief escaped from somebody in the back, and Miss Calloway was already moving, ushering everybody towards the front. "All right, everybody, get up. Let's go. Quickly, quickly." Nobody hesitated. As I grabbed my backpack and shuffled into the aisle, I stole one last glance out the window. Those bare footprints. They didn't fade and they didn't scatter. They just stopped. Right there at the edge of the light. Like whoever made them just melted into the ground. I think a lot of us got a look at that and then just went dead silent. It made no sense. None of the last hour made any sense. We were all in complete shock as we exited. We didn't run to the other bus. We walked, stiff-legged and too afraid to break the silence. It felt like if we moved too fast, if we screamed or shoved or gave in to the bubbling hysteria in our chests, we'd shatter whatever thin barrier was just keeping those things away. The new bus idled on the side of the road, headlights carving out this blinding wedge of safety in the dark. The driver, a tired Mr. Donaldson, leaned out the window. "What the hell's going on?" he called. "Dispatch said your engine died. Just open the door." Miss Calloway's voice cracked as she waved us forward. The door hissed open, and that was really all the invitation that we needed. We flooded inside, pushing past another, too desperate to sit, too frantic to care about order. Some of the kids were still crying, faces buried in their hands. Others just stared blankly ahead, bodies wound so tight they barely even seemed to be breathing. Ben and I took a seat near the back. I gripped the armrest so hard that my knuckles went white, and I couldn't stop staring at the windows of that broken down bus that we were leaving behind. The emergency lights were still flickering, a dull dying glow. The road, the woods, the nothingness beyond, it all just sat in eerie stillness. Those creepy footprints were still there, somewhat trampled by ours, but still there nonetheless. And the overlap creeped me out, like we were about to join their little tribe of whatever the fuck they were. The driver pulled the door shut and put the bus into gear. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as we pulled back onto the road and then chugged along. I exhaled, shoulders slumped. We were safe. We were okay. But just as the other bus faded off into the darkness, I swear to God I saw something move. Not in the woods, not on the road, but inside the abandoned bus. A shape, low, crawling, slithering between the seats. I turned away, pressing my forehead against the window. I didn't say anything to Ben. I didn't tell anybody because I knew even if I tried, they probably wouldn't believe me. Nobody ever would. Whether you want to believe me or not, that's my story.